I'll just briefly introduce you, Lalita, the students, and then you can start.
Sure. Yeah.
Everybody, please take this pleasure to introduce Srilalitha Gopalakrishnan. She was also my master's classmate at UCLA, in Singapore. Srilalitha Gopalakrishnan is a landscape architect with over 15 years of professional experience and diverse projects across Singapore, Malaysia, China, Hong Kong, and India. She has worked with Sierra Design in Singapore for over 11 years on projects ranging from residential, commercial, hospitality, institutional, recreational, and master planning, with many of the projects winning several awards. Her strong belief in integrated landscape design as an effective solution for sustainable high-density urban environments motivated the move towards pursuing a PhD in architecture and sustainable design at Singapore University of Technology and Design. Under the guidance and supervision of Professor Thomas Crawford at SUTD, she successfully completed her doctoral research, which focused on the performance of integrated landscape design in high-density urban environments for resilience and sustainable urban design solutions. She is currently working as a postdoctoral researcher and project coordinator for dense and green cities, emerging models of integrated urban development projects at Future Cities Lab Global. She is also the president of Singapore Institute of Landscape Architects, representing the landscape architecture profession in Singapore and the future. She represents SILA at various national level committees and strategic planning groups and chairs SILA's leadership in design strategic pillars to create and promote the integration of urban environments and complex natural systems through responsible, innovative, and resilient design. Thanks, Lalita. Yeah.
Thank you, Mahalakshmi. Let me first thank Mahalakshmi for really giving me this chance to meet you all and maybe share a little bit of what I've been doing in the past so many years. Let me just start sharing my screen first and then I can continue. Can you all see my screen? Yeah, okay. So yeah, she's kind of generously introduced me. Yeah, I've been doing a bit of here and there, delving into projects as well as research. So it's not a slideshow, right? It's something I can control myself, right?
Yeah, it's not just a slide.
But you can see the full screen on your own screen, or?
We see the notes that
there are a few things, right? Wait, let me change the display setting. Okay, I think I know why. It's my extended screen. Is it okay now?
Yes.
Okay. So I understand from Mahalakshmi that you all are working on a design studio which is focusing on biophilic designs. So it's something which the topic of biophilic design is something which I am very familiar with, and it's also something very close to where I come or where I'm practicing and where I'm settled now, which is Singapore. So today I don't plan to bore you guys with a lot of theory and things like that. So my idea is to maybe just have a nice photographic journey of different projects, of what people have done, how we have approached some of these ideas of biophilic design. And I hope that you are able to get some ideas from these visuals, which could then be integrated into your own design studio problem, right? And feel free to reach out to me if you have any specific queries on specific projects. I'll be happy to share with you all. Okay, so let's just proceed ahead. So a little bit, I think Mahalakshmi has already kind of told you about me, but today I am wearing multiple hats and I'm representing multiple roles today. So I just defended my thesis. So I'm technically still very much part of the Singapore University of Technology and Design. And I'm currently employed with the Singapore ETH Center Future Cities Lab at Future Cities Lab Global. It's a Swiss Federal Research Institute, which has a collaboration with Singapore. So I'm working on one of the Future Cities Lab global projects. I lead the project. I'm the project coordinator for the Singapore team. So, and finally, I also represent the Singapore Institute of Landscape Architects. I'm the president of the professional institute here. So, in that in all these roles, you are free to reach me at any on any platforms for any suitable collaborations you may be thinking of. Okay, so let me now get into the actual. Why isn't it moving? Okay, so I know you all must have been lectured by all your studio leads on what is biophilic design, right? So let's just do a quick recap. I guess biophilia in itself is a hypothesis. Okay, it's not something which is a theory or anything. It's a hypothesis which was proposed that generally we humans have this very innate instinct to connect with nature, right? So that was something which became a catchphrase, if you take it. And that took the form of what we call now as biophilic architecture, right? So in that, what do? We kind of integrate nature into building spaces because we know that it brings about well-being, it brings about good health, it releases stress, and there are a lot of other health benefits to it. So that's where this whole movement started, right? Like, how do you bring nature to closer to your daily life? Now, when we talk of integrating nature, so what does the term integrate mean, right? Integrate means to combine things in such a way that they become more effective, right? If you combine and they're not effective, it's not really integration. So in integrated design, we're talking of a more holistic approach, right? Where the design kind of brings together many different specialities. And then it is able to produce something at the end of it, which is like the sum of parts needs to be a much bigger than its own parts, right? So if it needs to bring about a significant change in the way the product comes to us. So in a way, we hope it becomes more sustainable, right? So when we look at integrated design, there are, of course, intradisciplinary. That means like within, say, architecture itself, you have to look at so many different aspects. So within that discipline, you have to look at many, many components, which were not as important in your normal way of designing. Then there's also interdisciplinary. That means there are knowledge which you need to leverage on from other disciplines, which is not integral into architecture, right? Say it's landscape, horticulture, psychology, lighting, even bioengineering. So all these are disciplines which are not within architecture, but it's something which you have to collaborate on. So it becomes intra as well as interdisciplinary. So we look at two different things, right? One is to connect with nature. So when we say connect with nature, what does it entail? It's a sensory connect. So that means what you see, how you feel when you're in nature. What do you see? What do you hear? What do you smell? Taste, touch, so those kind of sensory connects. Then there's element connects, right? Because when we say elements of nature, it's things like soil, water, sunlight, air, wind. So all these become integral to how you connect with nature. Then the other aspect is components, so materials. So when you look at why do you feel nice in nature? You know, you have plants, you have birds, animals. There's a lot of living organisms who interact with you. So that's also another level of connect, right? And then finally, the most important one is the process connect. So it's like when you are trying to connect with nature, it's also the various processes which occur in nature, like whether it is nutrient flows, photosynthesis, decomposition, soil formation, climate, even like reproduction, regeneration, microclimate. So all these are processes which occur in nature. So all these become important when you're looking at something called biophilia, because you're connecting with nature in many, many ways, right? Now, how do you then integrate nature into your living environments, right? So there, all these points which we talk of nature is what in as landscape, right? We say landscape architecture deals with designing spaces with the natural elements in balance and things. So in a way, we are looking at a landscape and architecture integrated approach. So that is really addressing the spatial integration of nature into your buildings. The other component is, of course, the process, right? We talked about the process which occurs in nature. So there are many of these processes. So we also need to see how do these processes get integrated when we are designing nature into cities, right? So it's all these complex interactions which happen between man and plants, man and animals, man and environment, and also between plants, animals, and environment. So it's a very, very dynamic process, which is what is now referred to as an ecosystem approach. And more significantly, it's called an urban ecosystem approach, because the difference between an ecosystem approach and an urban ecosystem approach is really about man being part of this whole process, right? So therefore, when you are looking at integrating nature, you have to look at both the spatial integration as well as the process integration. So when we say spatial integration, we are really talking of landscape and architecture really being looked at as one entity. It is not like you have a building and you are adding a layer of landscape over it. It's literally like visualizing them together as one entity. So what does it mean? It really means like blurring the lines between landscape and architecture. That means you shouldn't really be defining, this is landscape, this is architecture. There has to be this continuous dialogue between building and the greenery, right? So you don't really know where the building stops and where the landscape begins. And then there is also this idea of landscape becoming a part of architectural vocabulary. You know, like when we design buildings, we don't think about landscape as an integral part of the building, right? We always look at it to be a layer added on at some stage. So when you look at biophilic design, you cannot approach designs like that. You have to approach designs with landscape becoming a key start point when you are even looking at the building. Again, it's not new. We are not reinventing the wheel. It's been done ages back. It's always been there. So I'm sure you all are familiar with this project. It's really Falling Waters. I mean, something where personally for me, my first introduction to what integrated design looks like was Falling Waters, where actually you can't make a line to say where the building starts and where the nature begins, right? Another very personal favorite of mine is Jeffrey Bawa. All his projects have also been you know, exemplary cases where nature kind of takes over architecture. So the architecture is understated and the nature takes prominence. A more contemporary version, who's also one of my personal favorite, is Kerry Hill. If you don't know, please do Google him and look at his work. He is one of the very well-known architects in Singapore, and some of his works are really beautiful. So this is one of the projects in Langkawi, Malaysia. It's a Datai resort. I think it was also awarded the Aga Khan Award for its conservation and, you know, the approach. So as you can see here, the building exists, but it doesn't take over nature. Now, it's all nice when you have a setting like this, right? You have this beautiful mountains, you have these resorts and forests, and then you put a building in there. But what happens when you are in a very built, dense urban city, and then you have to create the same feeling, right? Is it possible? I think it is. So this building, I'm sure all of you are familiar with. You will also see a lot of visuals of this building in this presentation. This is a very, very urban business hotel in Singapore, in the heart of the business district. If I don't tell you this, you would imagine this is somewhere in a beautiful location in Bali or, you know, Hawaii or something. So what I'm trying to tell you is that you could still bring the same feel into the urban city, into the urban environments where we all are more familiar with. Another very interesting example is, I'm not sure whether you're aware of this project as well. Do Google and make a look at it. It's One Central in Sydney by Jean Nouvel. So again, a very, very urban place. If you see the setting, it's extremely urban, but the intent has been to bring nature as close to your daily living as possible. So there are very different approaches which people have taken to engage nature with architecture. So these are some of the examples which would be interesting. Now, I come from Singapore. I am in Singapore. I practice in Singapore. So Singapore is very, it's kind of identified itself as a biophilic city in a garden. And that journey has not been overnight, because Singapore has actually focused on integrating greenery from a very long time, you know, from its initial urban planning, even before all this talk of biophilic design and sustainable urban greenery and all came about. And some of the key reason is also that the policies have also aligned themselves with this idea of creating this city in a garden. So one of the most visually impactful policy change which happened in Singapore about 10 years ago, I think in 2008, about 2008, when they introduced this policy called LUSH. LUSH, I'm not sure whether you all have had a chance to do your R&D on biophilic design. I saw the list has Singapore as some of your case studies. So LUSH is actually a policy called Landscape for Urban Spaces and High-Rise Buildings. So what it does is, as you know, Singapore is very dense and we don't have space. So buildings were all kind of taking a more vertical form. So the more higher you go in terms of your urban living, you are that much detached from the ground. So how do you make sure that people still feel close to nature, or they still feel as if the gardens are at their doorstep? So that is when this whole idea of skyrise greening was introduced, to say that let's bring nature closer to people's doorsteps. So what it did was it kind of created a new ground plane for urban living. So in a way, if you're living, say, in a 30th story of a building, you don't have to come down 30 stories to the ground to enjoy your gardens. You may actually have a garden at your 30th floor, just come 2 floors down. So, you know, you kind of somehow reduce the scale and bring the ground plane higher. So there is enough research done on what this entails. We have learned our lessons, burnt our fingers, and made changes to the way we design these new typologies of buildings, where I think we call it dense and green typologies, because it's density, but we're also integrating greenery into it. So there are many guidelines which have been published. They are all available. So the reason I'm flashing this slide for you all is feel free to go and check these out. They are not, I think they have e-versions as well, if you are interested in. So it tells you a lot of guidelines on how you go about designing these. How do you make sure that the spaces you design are safe? So there are quite a few things which you can leverage on, if not for the studio, even for your own future. So going forward, where does Singapore look at itself? The new Singapore Green Plan for 2030 really looks at making this no more a city in a garden, but a city in nature. You know, that's a big shift which Singapore is attempting to do. City in nature entails a lot of adjustments to coexisting, right? It's no more for only people, it's for animals, it's for birds, it's for all other ecosystem services. So in a way, it's like, you know, where do we see ourselves? I mean, I reserve my judgment on this. We have a lot of work to do if we really want to go into being a city in nature. But these are just a sample of what you see today, you know, because of the way the greenery weaves through the city. We see otters crossing roads. We see monitor lizards at junctions sometimes, you know, taking the zebra crossings along with us. Hornbills are our regular visitors. They come and sit on my balcony every day. We also sometimes have monkeys posing with us when we are at the, and this is all like, you know, these are not inside some reserves, nature reserves. These are in very much within the central business district of Singapore. So that what it tells you is that it's possible to actually create nature within city. It just takes a lot of consolidated efforts. Yeah. So how do you go about designing biophilic architecture or biophilic designs, right? So I mentioned earlier there are spatial integrations. So what does spatial integration mean? So if you see, we talked about blurring the boundaries between architecture and landscape, having this constant dialogue between, you know, the built and the open spaces. So if you see this example, I would challenge you to tell me, where do you see the building stop and where do you see the landscape begin? So in a way, it's like you kind of have this seamless connectivity. So there is the spatial integration where you borrow the outdoor space into the indoor spaces, right? So this is Park Royal on Pickering on the ground level. Later I will show you the challenge which you had when you had to work on a project like this, and then how the spaces, how this idea of really blurring the boundaries leverages and includes a lot of space which is not part of your site. Yeah. So you also have spatial integration at an urban scale. This is also another project I saw on your list of case studies. It's called the Marina Barrage. The projects I'm sharing with you are all from Tierra Design, the firm I worked on. I didn't work on Marina Barrage, but Park Royal is my own project. So there are projects which we have worked on, and we've attempted to do some of the points which I'm already highlighting. So Marina Barrage is basically just a building which has nothing but big pump sets, you know, they're just pump rooms. So how do you make something as mundane as infrastructure of pump sets into something which becomes an active public space where people go to fly kites, have picnics, even take their wedding photographs? So that's what spatial integration can do when you look at buildings as not landscape and architecture, but as an integrated. Hi, Archana, any questions? You have something?
No, ma'am. I have just joined. Yeah.
Okay, sure. So another level, as I can I continue? Yeah. So
this is Ramaswamy. This is Ramaswamy.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, hello. Okay. In case people don't know, that's my uncle. Happy that you could join, and I hope your students could also get a chance to see it at some point of time. Yeah. Okay, so I'll continue. I mentioned about spatial integration. There's also something called infrastructure integration, which I spoke about as a process integration, right? So these beautiful looking landscapes are not just you know, pretty spaces, but they also function as infrastructure for your city. So they bring about water, you know, I think what you call as water sensitive urban design. So you use them as green blue infrastructure. An example where it's my very how do you say, I studied this project in great detail, not a project which I designed, but a project which I have researched extensively. It recently won the World Building of the Year award in 2018, if I'm not wrong. So you can see that even in a building which is like vertically integrated, you could still do the green-blue integration. So the spaces which we design are not just pretty and beautiful, but they also serve a larger system contribution. Now, when we say integrated design, right, what are the different edges of integration? So we have the horizontal plane, which is your lateral integration. Then you have your vertical plane, which is your vertical integration. So when we look at horizontal plane, what does horizontal plane mean? Where the building sits, right? Where the building meets the ground. So that becomes a key plane of integration. Usually, we assume it to be on the ground, right? But as I mentioned to you, when we look at skyrise greening, the ground plane is not just on the ground, it could also be up in the sky. But you have horizontal integration. So it's the place where the building meets the ground. So how do you integrate nature at that level, right? So options, there are roof gardens, there are sky gardens. So all these are not on the ground. The roof garden on my right is actually at the roof of a car park on 4th story. And the left picture, if you want to guess which level this garden is, it's at the 42nd level of a building. So these are all new ground planes where the same amount of greenery could be introduced. Another horizontal level is your terraces, you know, your balconies, your extended semi-open decks, bridges, you know, you have connections, you have corridors. So they all can also become elements where you can integrate greenery and nature. Even, you know, your sky bridges at the urban scale. You know, this one is a very famous project. I'm sure you all have heard about it, High Line in New York. So at that scale of the city as well, you could integrate the garden spaces into something which becomes a meaningful space. The other surface is, of course, vertical, right? So we have the horizontal surface, then we look at the vertical surfaces. So you could bring what we design on the ground into the vertical plane as well. So one surface is, of course, the facade, right? We could literally just pick the facade and bring nature into it. So what I show you are different variations of how people integrate it on the facades. So it could be as a creeper, which kind of goes through, climbs through the a skin of cladding, if I may call. If you see the difference, you know, it's no more like a glass surface, which we are very used to in you know, what our picture of what an urban CBD looks like is just sheets of glass, right? So now you break that mold and make it into a more breathable skin. And that's where introducing nature adds more value. You know, interestingly, if you see the project on the right leftmost, the tree house, it's actually a condominium. Currently, I don't know whether it still holds, but it was in the Guinness Book of World Records as one of the largest garden walls. The second, if you see the third project in the middle, which is the OFC Singapore, that's my own project. It was the first vertical green wall in Singapore, which entered the Guinness Book of World Records. So it's the extent of vertical greening which could be done. The second project, which is the Oasis downtown, is also a very, very well published project. The interesting part here is that we also saw a physical continuity in terms of the biodiversity, right? You could actually see squirrels running from the ground all the way to the rooftop of this building. I mean, that was another level of connectivity which we could do by introducing vertical greening. The farthest on my right is the Cecil Street. Again, it's a very, very small project, but something you all should also look into. It's a very well featured project. One of the first projects in Singapore which got recognized for skyrise greenery, or it's kind of refurbishing a building into something which is more biophilic. So these are projects which were my own projects. I mean, when I was working with Tierra Design. Another edge of integration in the vertical plane is, of course, all your planter edges, hard edges. So you don't need to necessarily extend greenery all through the facade, but you can break them down into these planter edges, right? Or soft edges. So what that does is it kind of steps up the greenery, but at the same time, it softens the whole, the visual impact of how these hard buildings look like. It's also the green columns, like, you can kind of hide away the columns and use plants in a very naturalistic way. Like, you don't need to train them on cables if you don't want to. Just let them droop down from the roof, from the edges, and create these natural screens, if you can call them. Now, combination of all of these is what kind of brings about a biophilic design, right? How projects have actually used these different planes of integrations, these different modes of integration, spatial, infrastructure, vertical, horizontal. And so what I'm going to do next is take you through a range of projects where a combination of all these have been done. And you can see the effects of what they bring about, at the end. So maybe these could be some ideas of how you could go about doing it for your own design project. So the first project I want to talk about is Park Royal on Pickering. By now, I think a lot of you are already familiar with the visuals of it, with the project itself. Now, if you see, the building in itself is a very, very thin building and very long building, right? And because of its location, we couldn't kind of dig it down and create a basement parking. So if you see the first 6 floors of this building, they are all nothing but car parks. So how do you treat a very mundane car park facade into something that becomes a very visually, how would you say, visually demanding facade, right? So that's where this whole challenge came about. How do you break down this facade? How do you soften this facade? So the architect's visual idea was to make this like a cave, right? Like, or something where nature kind of takes over time. Of course, it's nice as a concept, but no hotel developer wants their project to start looking like a rundown, like overgrown nature. So it's a very well maintained, very well curated landscape now, but the intent was to really make it look wild. So the different planes of integration, of course, as you can see, we had to look at every opportunity, every edge which the building can offer to add the layer of greenery to it. So there were many small edges which were explored. Continuity was tried so that there is both visual and physical continuity. And a very, very key part which we all have to remember when you design your project is the accessibility to these spaces, right, for maintenance. Because if you can't provide access to all these greenery, then they all will die off within 3 months, I can tell you. So if you see in these projects, all the planters are accessible from behind, they are safe and they are easy to maintain. So I think that's a very, very important aspect when you're designing. So this is how it looks now. Of course, it's interesting to see how the plants keep changing as I drive through this place every day. So as you see, there is greenery which is on the outside. There's also greenery which is on the inside. Now, the interesting part of this project is that all these, this so-called tiering planters which you see, none of them are accessible. They are just visual component. So it kind of contributes to the larger urban green impact, while for the rooms and for the individual guests, it becomes more like a feel of being inside a park. Another interesting project is the Tembusu condominium. This also won the President Design Award 2 years ago, done by the famous architecture firm called Arc Studio. If you don't know them, please do search for them. Their projects are really very, very nice. One of their award-winning projects is the Pinnacle at Duxton, which I'm sure you all would have heard of. So this is a project which I worked with them when I was at Tierra. So it was a first attempt where we tried to do a lot of these blue-green infrastructure integration into a private condominium. I mean, that's a challenge. I'm sure you all would understand that it's easy to do in a public project, but in a private condominium, expecting the residents to pay and maintain this was something which we had took on as a challenge. And this is how it looks now. You know, it actually is built the way it was designed. The greenery stretches not just one floor. Actually, it goes up to I think every module is about 6 floors. There are bridges connecting. All the green-blue infrastructure integration at the ground level was actually built. You could see the water features are not just visual elements, but they also contribute to the bioengineering methods of filtering and cleaning the rainwater before it gets discharged into the public utilities. Another very close project of mine is the Kongchan Natural History Museum. Now, this museum was also another interesting challenge because my clients were not, you know, laymen. They were scientists who know the plants and biodiversity way more than I can even think of knowing. So you had to really work together with them to build what they wanted to showcase as a museum of biodiversity. So here again, the space was very small. So we, the most impactful location was, of course, this small carved out green facade. And the design was done such that it was not like a custom-made system, which is expensive and difficult to maintain. A very simple, normal planter box system, but we treated and we detailed the facade such that it kind of resembles the cliffs of Singapore's native landscape. So this was the visuals which we had imagined when we were designing, some of the graphics which we presented to the client, and some of the, how do you say, the pressure which was put on us to say that you are showing me something, do you see that I can get this at the end of the project? And this is how it looks like now. It actually is thriving very well. There's immense amount of biodiversity. They record a lot of birds visiting these green walls. Another, the Ocean Financial Center, another project which I mentioned earlier, which was in the Guinness Book of World Records. If you want to imagine, what do you think is behind this wall? You know, actually behind this wall is just car park. So this entire facade is actually a green facade as a ventilation for the car parks. So the reason I'm showing this to you all is to say that you can push the boundaries where you don't think it's possible. So we had a lot of back and forth to convince you know, the authorities on allowing us to do something like this, but the entire facade is designed with 50% ventilation. So it's possible. It still looks like this. There was a lot of worry whether the wall will sustain. And these are gardens at the 42nd and at the 43rd level of that same building. So it's, the idea is that when you are in this space, you don't really know that you are actually at the 42nd floor of the building. The Cecil Street, which I also briefly referred to in one of my earlier slides, this is how the building looked like. It is a very, very prominent location in Singapore, one of the most expensive streets of CBD. And this particular building had no takers in a very prime business district location, purely because of the way the building looked. No office wanted to have their you know, their business address in this area. Then that's when it came for refurbishment. And we worked with AG Facade, a facade consultant, to try and get this building transformed into something which would become desirable. So you see all these beams and these columns which were there. So there were details of how can we add a layer of greenery to this using the existing infrastructure. So it was not about breaking it down and redoing everything, and how we could explore possibility of adding a garden within this atrium space. So all these were the initial ideas, and this is how it looks. So now the moment it got finished, Facebook wanted to take up a space. I think all the tenants in this building are top companies, and they are paying premium, and the property owner is very happy. He doesn't think spending the money to maintain this greenery is of great significance, because it's a very marginal amount to what he can leverage on in terms of the increased rental. Another project which at Tierra was a landmark, or in a way like we set benchmark, was of course the Terminal 3. I'm not sure if any of you have had a chance to visit Singapore. You could not have missed, because you have to enter through Changi Airport. So this was one of the largest green walls which was done in the terminal building. Of course, after Terminal 3, Terminal 4 now has another level of greenery integration. And if you don't know yet, you should know about this project, which is the Jewel, which was very widely featured done by Moshi Safti, which takes this idea of tropical architecture, or tropical landscape integrated architecture into a totally new level. So this is how the space looks inside. So if you ever enter Singapore, you cannot miss this building, because you have to come out through this building. It's not just for an airport infrastructure, it's a public space, it's a retail shopping mall, which people visit on a daily basis, or just to meet up with friends or have their dinners and lunch. Another interesting project which I thought would be good for you all to take up is also this Oasis Terrace. I mean, all these projects we saw, they look very expensive, right? They feel as if they are hotels and condominiums and airports. But this is actually a project done by the Public Housing Board in Singapore. And it's a community facility building for a very how do you say, a very new residential neighborhood in Punggol. So it's nothing but just a group of building which has spaces for, daily community needs. So you have food courts, some retail, supermarkets, classes, which for kids, they're coaching classes, function rooms for people to conduct activities. So it's really a community building. And even that building, the architect kind of stretched the idea of integrating greenery into it. So that's how the building looks now. It's really like an extended garden in its vertical dimension. Do take a look at these projects. I think all of these are very well published. The design of this was done by Siri Architects from UK, and in collaboration with Multiply Architects in Singapore. And Kampong Admiralty, again, a project by Woha, which was the World Building of the Year in 2018. A project which kind of redefines what a vertical urban design can look like. So if you see, we are actually standing at level 4 of this building, and this is what you see when you look out. So it's really the idea of overlapping different land uses in the vertical dimension, but not just the land use, but also all forms of urban design like circulation, open spaces, everything was integrated in the vertical dimension. A project which I think you all must have already extensively researched, Kutek Puat. I just wanted to share with you because it's something directly relating to your own design studio, because I think you're all designing a hospital or some kind of a healthcare facility. So if you see in this project, it's one of the oldest projects in Singapore, which redefined what biophilic design means in the field of healthcare. So it's not just for the people who visit the hospital or for the patients or the people who work there. The facility also is a very key kind of infrastructure for the entire neighborhood. So the whole hospital is actually, how do you call it? It's like a thoroughfare for even the neighborhood residents. So they could all actually enjoy the garden space, not just the people who come to the hospital or who have to visit the hospital. So, so it's basically like stretching this into a public amenity. And you can see the people who use the roof gardens, who farm in the roof gardens in the hospital, are not hospital staff. They are residents who stay in and around Kutek Pot Hospital. Then they also use the gardens to have performances. They use it as treatments for some of the older patients there. The patients tend to also use the gardens for their daily activities. It's all nice, right? Sometimes we get complaints from the hospital saying patients don't want to leave the hospital because it's too nice. So they have issues of people overstaying as well. Some interesting new development, which you may want to also take a look at. It's another new hospital in Singapore called Inteng Hospital, which also done by the same architects who worked on Kutek Puat. I think the design is by RMJM Hong Kong. They were the local architects, CPG. You can also take a look at how they have gone about designing this one. It's a much smaller facility than Kutek Puat, but they have tried to kind of go about the same idea of biophilic design in a different expression. I've personally visited this and was part of the jury to judge it. I still think it needs to mature, and maybe it might take the same language as Kutek Puat. Just to quickly delve into my other field, which is research. So we know all these kind of projects look nice, they feel nice, they work well. But what is also important is to see, are they really performing? Do they really give us the benefits which we all talk about? So that's what is the research which I'm involved in currently. So as part of the Singapore ETH Center, we did this research in 2018. It's called the Dense and Green Building Typologies. So the research actually analyzed the quantitative benefits of these dense and green building typologies to see whether do they really give us architectural, urban, social, environmental, and economic gains, right? So there were extensive study done over a span of 4 years to quantify some of the projects. Kutek Puat was one of the projects in the detailed case studies. So if any of you are interested, you can go and look out for this book, which published all the results of that study, as well as it has featured about 36 more international case studies, which also have shown some kind of exemplary cases of integrating greenery with architecture by very, very famous architects worldwide. I have also been a contributor for this book because I worked on the economic package of how the integrating of greenery kind of benefits. As a continuation of that, we are now commencing another study, which is the dense and green cities. So the previous study was really looking at the building scale. So the study concluded that the building in itself is very beneficial, but if we can extend it to a larger district, this whole expression of dense and green design, the benefits could actually multiply as well. So this study is really looking at how do you go about designing urban districts which become dense and green, right? So, so that's a study which we're just starting on. If you are interested to know more about this study, there is a YouTube link which I have put in on the slide, which explains this whole study in detail. Feel free to take a look at it and let me know if you are keen to get more information. So this is what I'm working on currently. Another project which we are also doing in parallel is this idea of vertical cities, which is where my PhD research was, which is on coming up with new methodologies to really analyze the spatial performance of vertically integrated landscape spaces. So we're really looking at new means of analysis. So in the past, we've been using a lot of urban network studies like space syntax, maybe even the traditional network analysis. So in this particular project, we're exploring complexity science as a new layer of tool, which offers us various methodologies to explore spatial connectivity. So that is where this project is headed. Again, there was a pilot done where we used Kampong Admiralty as a case study. You can go ahead. I have given a link. You can take a look at it. It's under the Center for Livable Cities under Ministry of National Development in Singapore. So there's more information on that and many other studies which are being done in the same lines to explore complexity science-based methods. So let me just end up with a very, how do you say, ambitious visual of where we see things going, you know, as cities are really going vertical. I think the expression of what biophilic design can be can also be very ambitious. So this is a visual by WOHA for a competition. They call it the permeable lattice city. So this is their vision for what a tropical vertical city can look like. Frankly, when I saw this visual, say 8 years back, it looked too ambitious, but seeing where we are headed now and seeing the kind of projects which we see, I don't see this being a fantasy anymore. It's getting much closer to reality. So that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lalita. We'll take questions now.
Yeah, so please feel free to bombard your questions. I'll try and answer as much as possible. Don't be shy. You can ask me very basic, mundane questions, things which you're all wondering, how can you do this? How can you do this?
So when can you hear us?
I can hear you, Mahalakshmi.
Okay, so when you design these green spaces and buildings,
Mm-hmm.
do you think about what greenery is like local to the place you're designing in, or does that not really
I cut off. So yeah, can you just summarize? I just heard part of your question.
Oh, okay. Is it audible? Is it audible now?
Yeah. Now it's okay. Yeah.
So when you're designing these green spaces and buildings,
Mm-hmm.
you think about like the vegetation and biodiversity that is already local to the area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. I think the very context of biophilic design is to use native species, right? So because native species will be sustainable and you don't need to do too much to keep them growing. So making sure that you use native vegetation is I won't say that you only have to use native vegetation, but try and use as much native vegetation as possible, you know. because that will help you to maintain it in the long run. Also, I think you need to also remember that the weather in Singapore is fantastic. So anything you put just grows. So that's not the same in India, because I worked in Delhi and I can tell you that I have cried when I look at the plants there. It's just full of dust. They look so dull. They just don't grow. So it's very important to understand the context of where you are designing, and be very aware that all these can only look nice if it can sustain, right? So whatever you are proposing, make sure that you give thought to how do you sustain them, how do you maintain them. So that's why you need to select where do you want to do these, like where do you want to introduce greenery. Make sure you introduce it where there is highest visual impact, and make sure you introduce them where there is good and easy access. Don't put them in places where it's difficult to reach, and don't put them in places where nobody sees it. Yeah, so remember that it needs to have both visual as well as like practical considerations. Yeah.
My audition.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the projects we saw today were on large scale, and I'm guessing the economical aspect would also be large there. So how would you suggest we can kind of scale it down but have the same impact in the setting of a city?
This idea of the economic aspect is something which everybody is very, very interested in, because we all think that it's very expensive, right? So the most successful projects are the ones where you do simple things but create high impacts. So don't try to kind of go overboard with it. So things like, you have edge planting along access routes, simple climbers along columns. So these are all very accessible areas where the impacts will be high and the costs are not very high. Like the moment you start doing, if you see the Ocean Financial Center, the entire green wall, of course, that's a very high cost project, right? But because it takes a lot of money to install a green wall of that scale. It is sustainable, but you have to spend for it. However, if you compare that to the Oasis downtown project, where you had this entire facade of that red colored building with green creepers climbing over it, that doesn't take a lot of effort to introduce the greenery, right? So it's a matter of the methodology. So if it's simple, you keep them in places which are easily accessible, and make sure you choose plants which are hardy and sustainable. You can actually bring down the cost significantly. So the costs go high only if you try to introduce customized, product systems, which are not something which everybody is familiar with. Yeah. I mean, that's what I learned across my projects, that if you see where I started and where my last projects are, you can see the change. So some of my later projects are the museum, the Kongchan Natural History Museum. If you know that the whole project was crowdfunded, so the budget was really like bare minimum, and you had to still produce an impact using possibly as little money as possible. So the methods, the details were all very, very simple, but the impact was as much as you could have imagined using a proprietary system. So I think the economics comes in the way you visualize, the way you identify, and the way you detail some of these things. Yeah.
I had a doubt regarding it's based on site, both urban context and natural context.
How do you have any inputs on how both of them can be given equal importance, and yet at the same time they stand out from what is already existing? Some sort of a coalition between the integration and differentiation in regard to both the concepts.
Again, it depends on what you are trying to do, right? So if you have a setting where the site in itself is very picturesque, you know, the nature component of your site is really strong, then you don't need to overdo it when you're designing the building, right? That means you have to make sure your building kind of responds to the setting. So the biophilic design in that context would be understated, right? In the sense like, how do you design your architecture to blend in with what nature surrounds it? Whereas in the other aspect where it's a very dense urban context where you really have nothing called nature around, there your focus has to be, how do I bring that idea of nature into the architecture? So there, I think your approach needs to be more of more integration than understatement, right? So it really depends on where you are looking at. You know, we often have this fight between architects, because I'm a landscape architect, like, why are you hiding my building, right? So there is always two approaches. Some architects feel that all this tends to hide the architecture, right? So you need to see how do you define this integration? You know, you can still how do you say, you can still make the architecture stand out if you know how you overlay the layer of landscape onto the building. So in terms of your question of how do you do it, I think it's really deciding where you overdo, where you understate. So sometimes less is more. So if you don't do too much, the impact may be much higher. Yeah.
I had a doubt about one thing which you told. Am I audible?
Yeah. I can hear you.
I had one doubt about the thing where you told we design the nature first and then building. So how do we do that? We decide where the landscape comes and then we decide building.
Oh, I don't think you can decide landscape first and then design the building. I think the whole point of integrated design is that when you are looking at building, right, you consider the component of greenery as part of your other building system. Like, you know, when you design a system, you think about facade, you think about services, you think about structure. So, you know, so if you want to do integrated design, it cannot be an afterthought. Like if I want to put trees on the roof, I cannot go and tell the architect once the structure has been designed, right? So that's what I meant by saying that landscape needs to become an integral component of your design process, not like, oh, now I've designed my building, so let's call the landscape architects to, you know, add greenery to it. So it doesn't work like that. You can do that, but the effect and the end product will not look like the way I have shown you. The project like Park Royal, I can tell you, we were working with the architects from day one, because we were kind of deciding what the structural depth should be. We were deciding where the column positions should be. We were working with them on the offsets of the facade walls, how the GFRC panel, which kind of fits onto the facade, works. So what I'm trying to tell you is that it's none of my business, right? I'm a landscape architect. I'm supposed to be a glorified gardener, but that's not the way it works. You have to actually work with the architects very closely, because it's no more like I'm putting trees on the ground. I'm going to put the trees on the building. So what does that do to the building? What does the building needs to adjust to accommodate something like that? So all that is a new layer of skills which you need to start taking yourself on. So since you are architects, I would say that don't think about architecture in its isolation. Start looking at everything together as a holistic process, right? So that's where I think if you're going to do biophilic design, or if you think that's the way forward, you need to also realign your thinking to how you design architecture, how you design buildings. So that's what I meant when I said that landscape needs to become an integral part of your design process.
Thank you.
Hi, and thanks for the great presentation.
Hi.
I'm just curious to know if you have dealt with any of the older buildings and what were the limitations and what were the challenges you faced in integration of the landscape?
Okay. You mean in terms of renovation or like, yeah, if you see Cecil Street was actually a refurbishment, right? That was not a new building. It was an existing building where we had to add this layer. So the challenge is, of course, the structural loading, like how much of that building can take it. There was also, if you see the Ocean Financial Center, which I showed you, the green wall, that was done on an existing car park. So in a way, it was added on to an existing built structure. So what it entails is, of course, adding a little bit more structural stability to some of the existing columns. There were other projects where we did a bit of green roofs. Again, all of these entails, depending on how old the building is, what kind of buffers the structure allows. So if you remember, there is a publication which I had also shared in one of my slides. It's called Structural Loads for Greening Rooftops, or structural for skyrise greening. So there was a lot of study done on how do you add landscape to existing buildings. So there are things like intensive greenery, there is extensive greenery, right? So extensive greenery is basically you kind of don't put trees, but you put shrubs, ground covers, lawns. So like what you see as a sweeping roof, right? So those ones are all extensive greenery. That means you kind of have a larger coverage, but it doesn't have too much of, like heavy loads on it. So it's a very thin layer of greening which you can introduce. Then the other one is intensive greenery. So then that's where you add more layers of green to it. So there's trees, there are shrubs, there are ground covers. So then your structural depths need to be higher. So you need to evaluate what the building can offer or what it can take. So often I think it's basically between these two, whether we go for intensive or whether we go for extensive. Usually if it is refurbishment of old buildings, you go for more extensive greening, where you use shallow planter boxes, edges. And often we have also introduced suspended planter boxes, where you kind of keep fiberglass lightweight planter boxes onto the roof, and then you plant them. So you don't really put soil directly on the roof itself, you actually add a layer of planter boxes on which you then do the planting. So there are means, because the worry is always the waterproofing, the worry is the additional loading of soil on the roof and whether the dampness can take and all that. So all that has also been addressed in some of the projects where we used a suspended system.
And also, I'm just curious to know if there are any softwares which support these kind of applications. Like, you said there is only certain load which takes, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Are there any tool which you use for that particular analysis or anything? How does it work?
Right now, I don't know whether they have converted that into a tool, but there are lots of work happening on BIM, which is a lot of offices are now using the BIM as a basis for detailing out the buildings. So are you familiar? I think I don't know how much the students are taught about BIM. BIM is basically building integration management. So what you do is you have like one common model on which all the different consultants work on. So it's like a collaborative model to put in all the different services. So that's a tool which some of the practices in Singapore are using. So there you can set, your range of the tree sizes, the soil depths, the things which then the structure engineer picks it up or the architects pick it up. So that's a tool which is currently being made or being used in practice. Other than that, there is no specific tools which I can tell you at this point of time, but there are a lot in progress. So maybe in a few years' time, I can come back and share with you some of the tools.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, Dinesh, is it? Yeah. Oh.
Am I audible?
Yeah. Go ahead.
So, how do you include this concept of biophilia in like the building material itself? Like, are there any specific materials that are more sustainable, or like any alternative material?
Yeah. I think there are a lot of research happening in materials also, this whole, the lab which I'm currently involved in, which is Future Cities Lab. There are modules which are looking at using, algae to make them into facades. There are materials like, I think my fellow researcher in my university looked at using clay as a 3D modeling tool. So they, instead of using like plastic, they actually used clay as a medium to 3D print. So there is mud, soil, and clay being used as facades and elements to integrate biophilia. Then what else? Of course, bamboo, fiber, all that is already ongoing, nothing new. But in terms of new materials, what else? I mean, the materials which are coming from nature itself, right, which can possibly be more renewable, can regenerate itself, can be resilient to the changes which we are observing in the weather patterns. So I think these are some things which are currently being experimented with. Yeah, if you look through for these materials, you might find some very interesting studies which are ongoing. Algae, there's mushroom, there is mud. I mean, 3D printing of mud, I thought was kind of stretching it a lot, but there have been studies done on that as well. So you could check out some of these. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think another person you should also research on is Van Roosgaard. He's a Dutch landscape architect, scientist. I don't know what he calls himself, but he experiments with very, very innovative designs and materials using biomimicry. So I'm sure one of your colleagues would know about him. Roosgaard, his name is Van Roosgaard. So he uses really things like, how do fishes radiate light? How do birds have colors? He kind of researches the chemical and the biological compositions of those. And he then translates them into the design materials to address some of the installations or projects he works on. So if you're interested in that, do go and check him out. Yeah, it'll be very, very exciting what he does.
And Lalita,
Yeah, I thought there's one question from Dinesh, right? He came up. Yeah.
Gaurav.
Gaurav, sorry. Gaurav Sareen, right? Yeah. Hi, Gaurav. Yeah.
Just wanted to ask you, like when you are designing a building,
Mhm.
in terms of building orientation, okay, do you have specific facades where you feel that it's easier to introduce greenery, it's like, like according to the sun path?
Yeah. Correct.
How does this work out? Or is it like a, it's like a strategy that, okay, fine, I'm going to have corridors which have greenery. So wherever they come, then I will probably.
Oh, no. Yeah. No. I think the climate and the orientation, it does play a big role. So if you are designing a new building where you have the opportunity to really orient the buildings according to, so then of course the south, southeast, west, they all receive enough sun, but north will not get much sun, north facade, right? So you have to make sure that the plants you choose, right, are also according to the light and the wind condition. So there are shade loving plants, there are shade loving creepers. So you could introduce them on the facades where you don't get much natural light, like more on the north and northeast, I would say. Whereas your south will get very high quantum of light. So you could introduce more flowering plants or sun-loving plants on that side. So I think it's not that you can't introduce them in the north facade, but it's the choice of plants. Like you can't just have one palette and expect it to work in all conditions. So light plays, and I think another important aspect is the breeze, the wind, the ventilation, because we don't tend to realize, but there is a need for good airflow for plants to grow well. So if you have facades which do not are not breathable, like like air can't pass through, they're like very stale kind of sections, then the plants also get stressed. So it's important to, just like we look at comfort for humans when we are designing buildings, in terms of breeze, in terms of light, I think the same goes for plants as well. So all those simulations you do for building performance, I think all that can also be applied when you are deciding on which phases to put the plants on.
I have another question very specific to healthcare projects. So, plants in general, at least probably in Indian conditions, what we see is that they attract a lot of mosquitoes, rodents, and pests. So, how do we tackle that, especially in a healthcare facility? Is it that we have our core facilities moved away from these green areas and only the maybe circulation spaces are getting this? How do we tackle this? Or there are specific species which can be used?
I think for mosquitoes, and I mean, in Singapore, people are very, very sensitive to this idea of dengue, right? They don't want any stagnant water. So one very basic thing which we all follow is not to introduce plants with very big leaf, or which has how do you say, succulents or something which has that option to hold water in. There are some water lilies, not water lily, the lily plant, then there are some ginger plants. They all have how do you say, like cup-like base where they can hold water. So you have to make sure that you try and avoid those kind of large-leafed plants which can hold water, mainly for the mosquito part of it, because mosquito breeding only happens if you have any kind of stagnant water. Rodents is a bit of a catch. I think I'm not sure whether there are any plants which don't attract rodents, or they can address the issue of rodents. But I think in terms of the most of the flowering plants tend to attract a lot more of insects, birds, and all these adds to the chances of the kind of issues we tend to face. But again, I don't think that's why I said when we say biophilic design, right? It's like you have two sides of the coin, right? It's all nice. There are good things which come with nature. There is also some not so good things which come with nature. So I think it's a matter of trying to see how do you balance it out between the two parts. So I'm not sure of rodents, frankly, so I don't think I can help you much, but I can always find out more for you. I'm sure there are studies done on that here, because all these issues have been experienced and have been dealt with. So I could just maybe share with Mahalakshmi some information on those parts, if that helps, because offhand I don't know if plants can do that or what kind of plants would help to address that issue. Mosquito, I can tell you, but I'm not sure of the rodents.
Lastly, just wanted to ask, so with so much of greenery coming inside our building, it requires a lot of water to support them. Okay. So what happens in cities where there's a scarcity of water, and how do we handle this? So I know there's water harvesting and recycling and all that, but with such huge green spaces, how is there a technical way out as to how we handle this?
I think the technical way out is the more obvious and practical way, right? A is we now are very conscious on what kind of plants you choose. Make sure you choose plants which don't need to be watered every day, which are hardy enough to sustain if there are dry spells. The other thing is also when you design these planter boxes, we provide for the, there is this capillary zone, so where the water can actually get stored, and in case there is a dry spell or for some reason someone forgets to water that area, then the roots can go down and take the water from that capillary section. So these are small things which we have done in the projects just to add to its sustainability. Of course, there is the auto irrigation part, trying to use rainwater harvesting. Even some of the green wall systems have this. We have also explored this idea of capillary the plants being smart enough to take as much water they want. Like you don't need to water them, you kind of provide with a trough with a certain amount of water, and then the plants take in whatever they want. So that also works because you kind of save water, you don't overwater things. So these are some of more smarter ways which we have tried to integrate irrigation into it. But it's always, it's a trial and error. Like if you need plants, you need water. Luckily in Singapore, we get a lot of rain. So for us, the other aspect is to make sure that the auto irrigation doesn't work when the soil is already wet. So we actually have to introduce soil sensors to make sure that irrigations get cut off because the soil is already wet. So here, I think the problem is a happy problem, like you have too much of water, like too much of rain. So we are able to leverage on that. But I know in India, water is a big challenge to see how you can provide water for such extensive greening. I think in my projects in India, we have tried gray water, bioengineering methods to filter and clean gray water and reuse that for landscape irrigation. So these are some of the things which we have tried in my own projects in India to try and save potable water being used for irrigation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
are in the studio. The students are conceptualizing a design. So they are still, thinking about the site. They are thinking about the whole idea of biophilia. One of the we see in the studio is that they're already thinking about access to green for multiple users. If you could guide them at this stage, how do they look at a biophilic design, beyond just access to green, which sometimes is very simplistic that every building is now looking terrace in our. But if you could just guide them how to look at a biophilia design more holistically, listening from you, it ignites their mind further. Yeah.
Sure. No, actually, I think it's kind of it's very interesting phase you guys are in, because if you don't have a site and you are in the process of finding a site, then it's also nice. Like you can look at it from two perspectives, right? One is, do you want to challenge yourself, put yourself in a highly built, dense, hard kind of urban context, and then see, can I create this oasis in the middle, right? So that is one approach.
Site is something we have given them, and
okay,
a very dense urban environment, thinking that this is the future. You have to be
okay,
in an environment with very little nature around you. So they do have sites. They are in the process of coming up with a concept design.
Okay. So I think what you all have to also see is, don't just look at your site in isolation. Can you see whether there is a way to connect it to any kind of green space which can be in the vicinity, not just at the ground level. Think about connectivity at the higher level. Because we always think about ground, right? We think as if we access, but remember, there are birds. Birds don't need ground to connect. They can actually connect through rooftops. They could connect through canopies. So look at corridors, corridors of connectivity. I think that would be very interesting. And whether what you are designing as a building or a so-called a green building into your site, how can that become like a point of connectivity for many other organisms, right? So not just for your site, but also to the urban context. I think that would be a very interesting approach than just looking. So that's what I'm trying to say is, think about connectivity in all dimensions. Don't just look at ground, and don't just look at people. It's not just connectivity for humans, it's connectivity for terrestrial organisms, for aerial organisms, like butterflies, bees. All these also connect, right? They don't need ground to connect. So I think there is a possibility to change the approach when you're doing this. The moment you start looking at it as a larger connectivity, I think you will see that your designs will be very different. You're not looking at a site, you're looking at what your site can do to a lot of other areas, and what other areas can do to your site. So both sides you need to actually look at, especially that's where biophilic design will be a success. If you can't do that, then I think independently doing that for a building is actually opportunity lost. So look at that. I think you have some very interesting examples in Vietnam, I think, right? The architects called Wo Tong Nha. You should look at their projects where how they introduce these kind of buildings in very dense city context, and how that has helped rejuvenate the biodiversity around its own neighborhood, with one building. So I think that might be something you may want to maybe refer to. Those architects, their work is very interesting. Wo Trong Nha. They're Vietnamese. It looks like I think your time slot is finished, is it? So maybe we should wrap it up. Okay.
I mean, we can, because the board is connected to UPS, but the classroom.
Okay. No worries. So as I said, feel free to let me know if you need any specific information. I can at least, give you leads from where you can learn more from it. try to find a there is tons of work done in the field of biophilic design, because now it's been nearly about 10, nearly about 10, 15 years now since architects have caught on to this idea of biophilic design. So there are very excellent examples which you all can refer to. And don't look at a project as like, like one project which has done well. There are a lot of elements in a lot of projects which are very interesting. So I think the trick is to pick the right elements of biophilic design and put them into your designs. So it is not like you have to do everything, but pick what works the best and try and innovate from there. Yeah.
And for sharing your experiences and wonderful projects. Insight. And not just theory, but this is what currently is happening.
Yeah. No, I think it's nice. It's always nice to share these things with students, because they can come up with different ways, different perspectives of what we have done. It also helps us to learn from them. So I'm always happy to share it with some young minds, because they are the future. So yeah, I'm sure they will come up with interesting variations. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks a lot for your time, and I hope you guys have can take away something from it, and hope you are able to come up with excellent, interesting, exciting designs. Do keep me in the loop. I'll be very interested to see what comes out of it. Yeah, sure. Okay. Thank you. And you can continue your studio now, right? Sure. Thanks, Mahalakshmi. Thank you to everybody. Bye-bye and have a good day.